A millionaire was crying at his wife's funeral when he noticed the presence of a young woman identical to her. The snow fell in gentle whispers outside the grand mansion, blanketing the world in a cold stillness that mirrored the grief inside. The towering stone walls of the house seemed to absorb the sorrow, their silence only broken by the muffled sobs of mourners. The air was thick with the scent of roses and lilies, their fragrance a bittersweet reminder of the life that had departed. Theodore stood near the fireplace, his hand clutching a small, framed photograph of his late wife. Her smiling face stared back at him, a stark contrast to the pain etched into his features. His silver hair, neatly combed, gleamed under the dim chandelier light, but his posture betrayed the weight of his loss. He had lost the woman who had been his anchor, his confidant, the love of his life. Now, as a widower, the mansion felt unbearably empty. The guests gathered in the main hall, dressed in somber hues of black and gray. Whispers filled the room, a murmur of condolences and shared memories. Theodore stepped forward to address them, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was my light in the darkest moments," he began, his voice cracking. "Her kindness, her laughter. She was everything to me." Tears glistened in his eyes, and he paused, struggling to compose himself. As he scanned the room, his gaze froze. Near the entrance stood a young woman, her dark curls framing a face that seemed eerily familiar. She couldn't have been older than 25, yet there was something timeless about her features. Theodore's heart skipped a beat. She was the spitting image of his wife at that age, a vision pulled straight from his memories. For a moment, he forgot the crowd, the ceremony, and even his grief. The young woman's presence was magnetic, her eyes locking with his briefly before she looked away, disappearing into the crowd. Theodore's breath caught in his throat. Who was she? Why was she here? The ceremony continued, but his thoughts were elsewhere. After the final words were spoken and the mourners began to leave, Theodore scanned the room for her. He moved through the crowd, his desperation mounting. But she was gone, leaving behind only questions and an ache of familiarity he couldn't shake. Hours later, as the house grew quiet and the last guests departed, Theodore stood by the window, staring into the snowy night. The image of the young woman haunted him. He couldn't ignore the resemblance. Was she a relative he had never known about? A distant connection to his wife's past? The possibilities swirled in his mind, refusing to let him rest. In his hand, he still held the photograph of his wife. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something other than grief, curiosity, hope, and a deep need for answers. The snowfall outside continued, relentless yet calming, as if urging him to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows of his wife's life. That night, as he sat alone in the empty mansion, Theodore resolved to find the young woman. He didn't know where to begin, but he couldn't let her vanish like a fleeting memory. Something inside him whispered that her appearance wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign, a puzzle waiting to be solved. And Theodore, driven by a mixture of longing and determination, decided he wouldn't stop until he unraveled the mystery. The following morning, the mansion was eerily quiet, its grandeur overshadowed by the weight of loss. Theodore awoke early, though sleep had been elusive. He wandered the halls aimlessly, his fingers brushing against the framed portraits that lined the walls, each one a testament to a life he once shared with his wife. Her laughter still echoed in his memory, but now it was accompanied by the haunting image of the young woman who had vanished before he could speak to her. As he entered the parlor, his eyes fell on something glinting faintly on the Persian rug. Bending down, he picked up a delicate brooch, a golden piece adorned with small, intricate flowers. His breath caught. It was identical to the one his wife had cherished for years, a treasured keepsake she had worn on special occasions. He held it up to the morning light, his heart pounding with questions. How could this be here? His wife's brooch was stored safely in her jewelry box, or so he thought. Theodore quickly made his way to her room. The scent of her favorite lavender perfume still lingered in the air, and the sight of her neatly organized belongings brought a fresh wave of sorrow. Opening the jewelry box on her vanity, he searched frantically. There it was, her brooch, resting exactly where it should be. Yet here he stood, holding an identical one in his hand. He placed both side by side, his mind racing. Was it possible the mysterious woman had dropped it? But why would she have something so personal to his wife? Theodore's hands trembled as he carefully placed the brooches back in the box, closing it as if locking away the questions threatening to consume him. Later that day, Theodore sought out Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper who had served the family for decades. She was in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough, her face etched with the lines of age and wisdom. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his voice steady but urgent. "Do you recall seeing a young woman at the funeral yesterday? Dark curls, striking resemblance to..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Mrs. Whitmore paused, her hands stilling. "Yes, sir, I saw her," she admitted cautiously. "A lovely young lady, though I didn't recognize her. Did she speak to you? Leave anything behind?" Theodore pressed, studying her reaction. The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. "No, sir. She didn't speak to me." Her tone was even, but her discomfort was evident. Theodore could see the way her hands fidgeted, the way her gaze darted away from his. Feeling the tension in the air, he decided not to push further. "If you remember anything at all, please let me know," he said softly before leaving her to her work. Theodore's thoughts were restless, each unanswered question compounding his frustration. He decided to visit the nearby town, hoping someone might have seen the mysterious woman. He walked through the narrow streets, stopping at the general store, the cafe, even the church. Everywhere he went, he described her, but the responses were the same shrugs, polite apologies, or genuine confusion. The trail was cold, and his hope began to waver. Meanwhile, Emma kept to the outskirts of town, her heart pounding with anxiety. She had seen Theodore searching, his face filled with a determination that unsettled her. Clutching the brooch in her coat pocket, she retreated to the solitude of the woods. She couldn't let him find her, not yet. The questions she carried about her own past were too painful, and the man's probing presence threatened to unravel the fragile walls she had built around herself. That evening, Theodore returned to the mansion, exhausted and disheartened. As he stood by the window overlooking the snow-covered grounds, he allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. "Who are you?" he whispered into the silence, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. "And why do you look so much like her?" Theodore sat in his study, the golden light of the fire casting flickering shadows across the room. His hands rested on a pile of old letters and photographs, remnants of his wife's life before they met. The brooch, now carefully stored away, was a constant reminder that there were pieces of her he had never truly known. As the hours passed, his frustration grew. He had always believed their love was built on honesty, yet the presence of the mysterious young woman challenged everything he thought he understood. Deciding he needed answers, Theodore delved into the boxes of memories his wife had kept. Most of the letters were familiar notes exchanged during their courtship, family correspondence, but one envelope caught his eye. It was tucked beneath a faded photograph, sealed with a wax stamp that bore no recognizable insignia. His heart pounded as he broke the seal. The letter was brief but enigmatic. It spoke of a journey to a remote village and referenced an unforgettable decision. There was no date, no signature, only a location that he had never heard her mention. Theodore's mind raced. Had she been hiding a part of her life from him? If so, why? The next morning, Theodore confronted Mrs. Whitmore again. He found her in the conservatory, tending to the plants his wife had adored. The room was warm and filled with the scent of blooming orchids, but the atmosphere between them was tense. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I need you to be honest with me. There's something about my wife's past that I don't understand. I found a letter, and it mentions a village. Do you know anything about it?" The housekeeper hesitated, her hands tightening around the watering can. "Sir, some things are better left in the past," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. Theodore's patience frayed. "If you know something, you owe it to me to tell the truth. I deserve to understand the life of the woman I shared so many years with." Mrs. Whitmore sighed, setting the can down. "She was a good woman, sir, but she carried burdens she didn't want anyone to bear. There was a time before you met her when she went away for 2 years. She never spoke of it, but I know it changed her. She returned different, stronger, but also guarded. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Theodore asked, his voice a mix of anger and hurt. "She made me promise," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "She said it was her story to tell, not mine. I respected her wishes." Theodore's jaw tightened. "And now she's gone. How am I supposed to understand her without the truth?" Mrs. Whitmore didn't answer, her expression a blend of guilt and loyalty. Determined, Theodore decided to visit the village mentioned in the letter. The journey was long and arduous, the snow-covered roads winding through dense forests. When he finally arrived, the village was a quiet, humble place. Theodore asked about his wife, using her maiden name, but no one seemed to recognize it. Frustration gnawed at him until he stumbled upon an elderly woman who worked in a small inn. "She stayed here," the woman said, her voice frail but clear. "Many years ago, she came alone, carrying a sorrow I couldn't quite understand. She kept to herself mostly, but she visited the church often. The church stood on the edge of the village, its stone walls weathered by time. Inside, Theodore found a priest who remembered his wife. She was a kind soul," the priest said, leading Theodore to a small alcove filled with candles. "She came here often to pray. I remember she spoke of making amends, of hoping to find peace. What was she trying to make amends for?" Theodore asked, his voice trembling. The priest hesitated, his eyes scanning Theodore's face. "She never said directly, but I believe it had to do with a child." Theodore felt the air leave his lungs. A child? His mind reeled as he tried to process the implications. Was the young woman he had seen connected to this hidden chapter of his wife's life? Before he left the church, the priest handed him a small notebook. "She left this behind. Perhaps it will offer you the answers you seek." That evening, back at the mansion, Theodore sat in his study, the notebook resting in his hands like a fragile relic. Inside, the pages were filled with his wife's elegant handwriting, documenting moments of her life he had never known. There were entries about her time in the village, reflections on love and loss, and a recurring mention of a daughter. Theodore's hands trembled as he read. Each word unraveled a part of the woman he thought he knew, leaving him with more questions than answers. The truth was undeniable now. His wife had kept a monumental secret from him. And the mysterious young woman was the key to understanding why. The next day, Theodore spotted her again, this time in a nearby town. She was walking along a narrow street, her coat pulled tightly around her against the biting cold. His heart raced as he followed her, determined not to lose her again. But when she turned and saw him, her eyes widened with fear, and she disappeared into the crowd. Frustration and determination burned within him. He would find her, no matter what it took. The truth about his wife, about the life she had hidden, was within reach, and Theodore refused to let it slip away. Theodore paced the length of his study, his mind racing as the flickering shadows of the fire danced on the walls. The notebook lay open on the desk, its words echoing in his thoughts. His wife's secrets were no longer whispers, they were written in her own hand, undeniable. Every entry spoke of a life he had never been a part of, a daughter he had never known existed. His determination to find the young woman grew stronger, fueled by an aching need to understand his wife's choices and to offer her daughter the answers she deserved. The following day, Theodore set out early, the cold winter air biting at his face as he drove into the nearby town. He scoured the streets, his eyes searching every corner. Hours passed with no sign of her, but just as his resolve began to waver, he caught a glimpse of her familiar figure entering a small church at the edge of town. His heart raced as he parked his car and made his way inside. The church was quiet, its pews mostly empty. The warm glow of candlelight filled the space, casting long shadows on the stone walls. Theodore's eyes quickly found her. She was sitting in the front row, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together as though she were praying. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her, but the urgency of the situation spurred him forward. When he reached her, she looked up, startled. Her eyes, wide with a mix of fear and confusion, met his. "Please," he began softly, his voice trembling. "I don't mean to frighten you. I just need to talk." Emma's gaze darted around the church, searching for an escape. "Why are you following me?" she asked, her tone defensive. Theodore took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Because I think you're connected to someone I love deeply," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "My wife." Her expression faltered for a moment, the walls she had built around herself flickering. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, standing abruptly and clutching her coat around her. "Wait," Theodore pleaded, his voice breaking. "I found this." He held out the brooch, its golden surface catching the light. "This belonged to my wife. And I believe she was your mother." Emma froze, her breath hitching as she stared at the brooch. Her fingers instinctively moved to her pocket, where an identical brooch rested. The realization struck her like a thunderbolt, and she felt the weight of the truth she had been running from her entire life. "I don't have a mother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She left me when I was a baby. She didn't want me." Theodore shook his head, his heart aching at her words. "That's not true. I don't know why she made the choices she did, but I know she loved you. She carried the memory of you with her every day." Emma's defenses crumbled slightly, and she sank back into the pew, her hands trembling. "How can you know that? You didn't even know I existed." Theodore hesitated before sitting beside her, his voice low and steady. "I found her journal. She wrote about you, about the pain of leaving you. She said it was the hardest thing she ever did. I don't know why she felt she had to do it, but it broke her heart." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she absorbed his words. Her mind raced with questions she had buried for years. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why do you care?" "Because I promised myself I would find you," Theodore said, his voice firm. "Not just for her, but for you. You deserve to know the truth, to hear how much you are loved." Emma's emotions surged like a tide, the pain of abandonment colliding with the hope that maybe, just maybe, her mother's love had been real. "She didn't come back for me," she said, her tears falling freely now. "Why didn't she come back?" Theodore struggled to find the right words. "I don't have all the answers," he admitted. but I know she wanted to. I think she was afraid. Afraid she had hurt you too much, that you wouldn't forgive her. Emma's sobs filled the church, the years of suppressed grief pouring out. Theodore sat beside her silently, offering no words, only his presence. When her tears finally subsided, she looked at him, her face a mixture of vulnerability and cautious hope. "Why now?" she asked. "Why did it take so long for someone to find me?" Theodore's shoulders sagged with the weight of his guilt. "Because I didn't know. If I had, I would have looked for you the moment she was gone. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right now." Emma nodded slowly, her walls beginning to lower. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted, "or her, but I want to know the truth." Theodore placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Then let's find it together," he said. No more running. No more secrets. As they left the church together, Theodore felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Emma, though hesitant, had taken the first step toward healing. And he, too, felt the beginnings of a new purpose to honor his wife's memory by helping her daughter find the love and closure she deserved. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they were facing it together. Theodore and Emma walked side by side through the quiet streets, the cold air biting at their cheeks. Snow crunched beneath their feet, but neither seemed to notice as they were lost in their thoughts. Theodore stole glances at Emma, her guarded expression a mix of pain and curiosity. Though the gap between them felt immense, he clung to the hope that time and honesty could bridge it. Back at the mansion, Theodore hesitated before inviting Emma inside. This was her home, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "And if you're willing, I'd like to show you the pieces of her life that she left behind." Emma looked at him warily but nodded. The grand house loomed before her, its size and elegance overwhelming. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the faint scent of lavender welcomed her, a stark contrast to the icy walls she had built around herself. Theodore led her to his wife's room, where the faint traces of her presence still lingered. "She loved this space," he said, gesturing to the vanity filled with neatly arranged bottles of perfume and trinkets. "It was where she wrote, dreamed, and reflected. Maybe you'll feel closer to her here." Emma hesitated at the door, her fingers grazing the frame as if afraid to cross the threshold. Slowly, she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room. Her gaze landed on the jewelry box, and Theodore, sensing her curiosity, opened it to reveal the twin brooches lying side by side. "These belonged to her," Theodore said gently. "One stayed with her, and the other somehow found its way to you." It's as though she never truly let go. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked up one of the brooches. The weight of it felt heavy in her palm, not just physically, but emotionally. "She kept this all these years," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why didn't she come back for me?" Theodore's heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "She thought she was protecting you," he explained. In her journal, she wrote about the fear of her past mistakes affecting your future. She loved you more than anything, but she was also human, flawed and scared. Emma sank into the chair by the vanity, her tears falling silently. She turned the brooch over in her hand, her reflection staring back at her from its polished surface. "I spent so many years thinking I wasn't enough," she admitted. "That if I had been better, she would have stayed." Theodore knelt beside her, his hands resting gently on hers. "You're always enough," he said firmly. "Her decisions weren't a reflection of you. They were her struggles, her pain. But you were never the problem, Emma. You were her joy." Her sobs deepened, and Theodore stayed by her side, his presence steady and reassuring. He didn't try to fix her pain or rush her healing. Instead, He offered her the one thing she had never received: understanding. Hours passed as Emma sifted through the keepsakes in the room: letters, photographs, and mementos that painted a picture of a woman she had longed to know. Each piece brought new revelations and emotions, from laughter at a silly photo to heartbreak at the journal entries filled with regret and longing. Among the items, Emma found an envelope tucked beneath a stack of papers. Her name was written on it in her mother's handwriting. She hesitated before opening it, her breath catching as she unfolded the letter. "My dearest Emma," it began, "not a day has gone by when I haven't thought of you. Leaving you was the hardest choice I've ever made, and it's one I've carried with me every moment since. I wanted to protect you from a world I thought I couldn't shield you from. I can never undo the pain I caused, but I hope one day you'll understand that my love for you has always been unconditional. If you ever find this, know that you are my greatest joy and my deepest regret. Love always, Mom." Emma clutched the letter to her chest, her tears flowing freely. She turned to Theodore, her voice trembling. "She really did love me." Theodore nodded, his own eyes glistening. "More than anything. And I know she would want you to feel that love now, even if she can't give it to you herself." The days that followed were a turning point. Emma stayed at the mansion, slowly opening herself up to Theodore and the life her mother had built. They shared stories. Emma spoke of her years in foster care, the loneliness and resilience it had taught her, while Theodore recounted cherished memories of his wife, painting a picture of her that Emma had never known. As the bond between them grew, so did Emma's understanding of her mother. She began to see her not as the distant figure who had abandoned her, but as a complex, flawed woman who had made a painful choice out of love. And through Theodore, she found a connection to the family she had longed for her entire life. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Emma turned to Theodore. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on me, for helping me see her in a new light." Theodore reached for her hand, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for letting me. You've given me a chance to honor her memory in a way I never thought possible." Their journey had been filled with pain and revelations, but it had also brought healing and forgiveness. Together, they decided to keep her mother's legacy alive, not through grand gestures, but by cherishing the love she had left behind. Emma found solace in the stories, the keepsakes, and most importantly, in the bond she was building with Theodore. As the snow continued to fall outside, the mansion, once a place of sorrow and secrets, began to feel like a home again. And for the first time in years, both Theodore and Emma felt the warmth of a family they thought they had lost forever. The morning sun broke through the heavy curtains of the mansion, spilling soft golden light across the room where Emma sat by the window. Outside, the snow glistened like a blanket of diamonds, untouched and serene. She held a steaming cup of tea in her hands, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the frosty trees stood tall and proud. For the first time in years, she felt the heavy weight on her chest beginning to lift. Downstairs, Theodore moved through the kitchen, carefully assembling a breakfast tray. His movements were deliberate, as if each action carried a purpose. It had been years since he had shared his mornings with someone, and the thought of Emma being there filled him with a quiet joy. He added an extra touch, a sprig of rosemary from the garden his wife had once loved, and carried the tray to the sitting room. "I thought you might like something warm to start the day," Theodore said as he placed the tray on the small table beside her. Emma looked up, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm, but still carrying a note of uncertainty. She glanced at the tray, her eyes lingering on the rosemary. "She used to grow that, didn't she?" Theodore smiled faintly, sitting across from her. "She did. She always said it reminded her of home, of simpler times. I thought it might bring a little comfort today," Emma nodded, running her fingers along the edge of the teacup. The tension between them had eased over the past days, replaced by a cautious but growing connection. Each story Theodore shared about her mother painted a clearer picture, helping Emma reconcile the image of the woman who had left her with the woman who had loved her deeply. Later that day, Theodore took Emma to the library, a grand room filled with towering shelves and a roaring fire. He pulled out a small leather-bound album, its edges worn with time. "I think this might interest you," he said, handing it to her. Emma opened it carefully, her breath catching as she flipped through the pages. It was a photo album, filled with snapshots of her mother's life before and after meeting Theodore. There were pictures of her laughing at a picnic, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, and standing in front of the very church Emma had sought refuge in. Toward the back, there was a single photograph of a baby, wrapped in a soft blanket, with a handwritten caption below, "My Emma." Tears welled in Emma's eyes as she traced the edges of the photo. "She kept this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She didn't forget me. She never could," Theodore said gently. "She carried you in her heart every single day. And now I hope you can carry her love in yours." Emma closed the album, holding it close to her chest. "It's hard," she admitted, "to let go of the pain. But I want to try. I want to remember her for who she was, not just for what she did. That's all anyone can ask for," Theodore replied. "Healing takes time, but you're not alone in it. We'll face it together." Over the following weeks, Emma began to settle into the mansion, slowly allowing herself to feel at home. The rooms that once felt cold and imposing became familiar and warm. She found herself drawn to the garden, where she spent hours clearing the snow and tending to the dormant plants. It became a place of reflection, a space where she could feel her mother's presence and begin to nurture her own growth. Theodore, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. His days were no longer filled with solitude, but with the joy of watching Emma rediscover herself. He showed her the places his wife had loved, shared memories that had once been too painful to speak of, and encouraged her to embrace the life ahead of her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Theodore reached for a small wooden box he had kept hidden for years. "There's one last thing I'd like you to have," he said, handing it to Emma. She opened the box carefully, revealing a delicate necklace with a single intricate pendant. Inside the pendant was a tiny photograph of her mother, smiling softly. "She wore this on our wedding day," Theodore explained. "She told me it was her reminder to always carry love close to her heart. I think it's time it belongs to you." Emma's hands shook as she held the necklace, her tears spilling freely. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Theodore placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've brought so much back into this home, into my life. I should be the one thanking you." As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, the two sat together, bound by the memory of a woman who had left an indelible mark on both their lives. The mansion, once a symbol of loss, now stood as a testament to the power of healing, forgiveness, and the unbreakable ties of love. Their journey wasn't over, but it had begun anew, filled with hope and the promise of brighter days. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories.